Hello, welcome to the presentation for 2022 China Today. Today we'll continue to talk about the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. And today we're looking at more as the background. Or alternatively, we can call it, sorry, let me just switch on the slides first, okay? So alternatively, we can ask why doesn't China sanction Russia? There's of course a lot of reason, but today we will more looking at the background, and then next week we will look at some geopolitical reasons why China and a lot of other countries refuses to sanction Russia. Well, Los Angeles Times, a op-ed opinion article. Russia got a point. The U.S. broke a NATO promise. So let's see what kind of promise is being broken. The article itself is published in 2016, May 30th. So don't say it is just a recent knowledge. It has been known for a long time. The United States failed to uphold a promise. The promise is NATO would not expand into Eastern Europe, which is a deal made during the 1920 negotiations between the West and the Soviet Union over the German unification. The West has rigorously protested that no such deal was ever struck. However, hundreds of memos, meeting minutes, and transcripts from U.S. archives indicate otherwise. It's not the Russia archive, it's in the U.S. archive. Although what documents reveal isn't enough to make Putin a saint, it suggests that the diagnosis of Russia predation isn't entirely fair. Europe's stability may depend just as much on the West's willingness to reassure Russia about NATO's limits as on deterring Moscow's eventualism. And later on, I will show you a similar event, which is in 1962. Under the same situation, we will look at what United States will do in the reaction. Back in the 1990s, in the early February, U.S. leaders made the Soviets an offer. According to transcripts of meetings in Moscow on February the 9th, then Secretary of State James Baker suggested that in exchange for cooperation on Germany, U.S. would make ironclad guarantees that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. Less than a week later, Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to begin reunification talks. No formal deal was struck, but from all the evidence, the quid pro quo was clear. Gorbachev acceded to Germany's Western alignment, and the US would limit NATO's expansion. Nevertheless, great powers rarely tie their own hands. In internal memorandums and notes, US policymakers soon realized that ruling out NATO's expansion might not be in the best interests of the United States. By late February, Bush and his advisors had decided to leave the door open. After discussing the issues with West German Chancellor on February 24 to 25, the U.S. gave the former East Germany special military status limiting what NATO forces would be stationed there in deference to the Soviet Union. Beyond that, however, talk of proscribing NATO's reach dropped out of the diplomatic conversation. Indeed, by March 1990, State Department officials were advising Baker that NATO would help organize Eastern Europe in the U.S. orbit. By October, U.S. policy makers were contemplating whether and when, as National Security Council memo put it, to signal to the new democracies of Eastern Europe NATO's readiness to contemplate their future membership. At the same time, however, it appears the Americans still were trying to convince the Russians that their concerns about NATO would be respected. Baker pledged to Moscow on May 18, 1990, that United States would cooperate with Soviet Union in the development of a new Europe. And in June, per talking points prepared by the NSC, the National Security Council, Bush was telling Soviet leaders that the United States saw a new inclusive Europe. So let's look at a video depicting the expansion of NATO starting in 1949. And then later on in the subsequent slides, we will repeat the times again. Turkey in, and then we will see Spain in German first. And then we'll see Spain joining. Very close to the collapse of Russia now. Russia's collapsed it. Different color represent different things. This is the individual partnerships. This is today. Remember, NATO is a military alliance of 28 European and 2 North American countries that constitute a system of collective defense. From its formation in 1949, with 12 founding members, NATO grew rapidly by including Greece and Turkey in 1952, West Germany in 1995. The addition of Western Germany into NATO prompted the Soviet Union to adopt their own collective security alliance, informally called the Warsaw Pact. Later that same year, the next country to join NATO was Spain in 1982. In 1990, the Soviet Union and the NATO reached an agreement that a reunified Germany would join NATO under West Germany's pre-existing membership. Although restrictions were agreed to on the deployment of NATO troops on former East Germany territory, the discussion of the Soviet Union, this dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 led to a number of former Warsaw Pact and post-Soviet states requesting to join NATO. So let's run back the clock to 1962, talk about the Cuba Missile Crisis. That is a little bit over 1 month, 1 month and 4 days, the confrontation between United States and Soviet Union, which may escalate into a global destruction. So it is an international crisis, and eventually it was resolved by the cool-headedness of both the USSR and United States head of state. In response to the presence of American Jupiter ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey, and also of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion is an American organized invasion into Cuba. So Cuba was asking for help from the Soviet Union. The Soviet first secretary agreed to Cuba to place nuclear missiles on the island to deter a further invasion. An agreement was reached during a secret meeting between the first secretary and the Cuba's prime minister in July 1962. And after that, then a construction of a number of missile launch facilities started that summer. Okay, so let's look at what is the base of Pigs invasion. So let's go look at the Pigs. I have a here. So let's look at this one.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War, October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the moment during the Cold War when the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, came close to nuclear war. Secret communications and miscommunications which played out between the White House and the Kremlin made the crisis a unique event. After the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 by the Kennedy administration, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement with Cuban Premier Fidel Castro to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter any further U.S. aggression. For some time, the Soviets had been sending surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles to Cuba, but President John F. Kennedy did not protest. However, he warned that if offensive weapons were sent to Cuba, that the gravest issues would arise. On October 14, 1962, U.S. U-2 spy planes took several photos showing sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles under construction in Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, who had promised not to send offensive weapons to Cuba, had been lying. To help him deal with the crisis, Kennedy assembled a team called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. At first, they favored bombing Cuba with debate over the scale of the attack. The president decided upon a middle course, and on October 22nd ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, the term quarantine being used instead of blockade, as blockade assumed a state of war existed. Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev stating that the United States would not permit offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, demanding that the Soviets dismantle the missile bases and return all offensive weapons to the USSR. He also went on national television to inform the public of the crisis, in which he said, "It shall be the policy of the nation to regard any nuclear missiles launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." On October 24th, Khrushchev responded to Kennedy describing the U.S. blockade as an act of aggression, and the Soviet ships sent to Cuba would be ordered to keep going. Some Soviet ships turned back, and others proceeded. They were stopped by the U.S. naval forces but were discovered to contain no offensive weapons. Nevertheless, U.S. reconnaissance flights over Cuba indicated the Soviet missile sites were nearing operational readiness. With no clear solution to the crisis, the U.S. forces were put at DEFCON 2. On 26 through 27 October, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a message stating that the USSR would remove missiles from Cuba in return for a promise from the United States not to invade the island. Resolution to the crisis was now looking hopeful, but later, a second letter was sent by Khrushchev which provoked debate again. It demanded that the deal would also require the removal of U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That same day, a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance jet was shot down over Cuba. Kennedy prepared for an attack on Cuba within days as they searched for any remaining diplomatic resolution. That night, Kennedy ignored Khrushchev's second message and proposed to the Soviet Union steps for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba under supervision of the United Nations and a guarantee that the United States would not attack Cuba. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was sent to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin and indicated that the United States were planning to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey anyway, and within 6 months. This was to be kept top secret. The next morning on October 28th, Khrushchev issued a public statement that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. The crisis was over. The world escaped nuclear war in October 1962, largely because of the cautious natures of Kennedy and Khrushchev. In 1963, a telephone hotline was set up to give instant contact between the two leaders, and a nuclear test ban treaty was signed. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed, meaning the superpowers promised not to supply nuclear technology to other countries. Subscribe to see more history videos. Get simple.
Okay, then we will look at some Ukraine history. This one again, I'm using a video to tell you the details.
Will Russia go to war with Ukraine? All week, you've heard numerous answers to this question. In Ukraine, 71% of the people believe their country is already at war with Russia. This is a complex crisis, and all the answers are hidden in history. Did you know there was a time when Kiev was more powerful than Moscow? There was also a time when Ukraine and America were adversaries. Tonight, we'll bring you all these stories. We will tell you why Russian President Vladimir Putin is obsessed with Ukraine. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay, and this is Gravitas Plus. We begin in the 9th century. There was a state called Kievan Rus. This is where it was located. The Slavic people lived here. The city of Kiev was their capital. Between 980 and 1015, the Kievan Rus was ruled by Grand Prince Volodymyr. In Russian, his name is Vladimir. In Ukrainian, Volodymyr. And as fate would have it, these are also the names of the presidents of these two countries today. Anyway, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians draw their lineage from this Slavic state. A lot changed in the centuries that followed, and for a lot of it, Ukraine was under Russian rule. In the 1900s, the two were Soviet republics. Russia, the most powerful of the 15 republics, and Ukraine, the second most powerful. It had defense industries, large agricultural lands, and housed much of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. During the Cold War, Ukraine was the arch rival of the United States. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Ukraine became independent, as did Russia. Ukraine inherited much of Soviet nuclear arsenal, but gave it up to Russia in 1994. In exchange, Moscow guaranteed Ukraine's security and promised to respect its sovereignty. They signed the Budapest Memorandum along with these countries. Cut to November 2013, Viktor Yanukovych was the president of Ukraine. He had a reputation for heavy-handedness, corruption, and above all, for being openly pro-Moscow. In 2013, he rejected an EU trade deal. This deal could have meant greater integration with the European Union. Instead, Yanukovych decided to take a $15 billion bailout from Russia. To many Ukrainians, it felt like being sold to Moscow, so protests broke out. They were called Euromaidan. Euro because these protests were about Europe, and Maidan because they happened in Kiev's Maidan, what we today know as the Independence Square. Here, protesters chanted, "Sign the EU deal, Yanukovych must step down." Russia supported the president, the West supported the protesters. In February 2014, Yanukovych's government was toppled, the president was driven out of Ukraine, he fled to Russia. Not every Ukrainian was happy with this. Many in the Russian-speaking East wanted Yanukovych to stay. When he was driven out, the minority felt disenfranchised. On the other side of the border, Russia was angry it had lost its puppet. To salvage the situation, Moscow annexed Crimea. Why Crimea? Well, let's now zoom into this part of the world. Crimea is a peninsula. It is located in the Black Sea. In 1954, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred Crimea. It was given to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. Why? Khrushchev hoped the transfer would strengthen, quote-unquote, brotherly ties between the Ukrainian and Russian people. Both Russia and Crimea were part of the Soviet Union, so this transfer did not mean very much. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, Crimea joined it. The peninsula was given special autonomy. It remained home to Russian military bases. Moscow promised to respect Crimean autonomy. Many in Russia were of the opinion that Crimea should not have been allowed to join Ukraine. In 2014, when Yanukovych was ousted from power in Ukraine, Russian military began seizing government buildings in Crimea. Soon the entire peninsula was under military occupation. A referendum followed. On the 16th of March 2014, Crimeans voted to become a part of Russia. Was this vote legitimate? Well, it depends on who you ask. For Putin, this was Crimea's liberation. For the rest of the world, this was Crimea's annexation. The focus then shifted to eastern Ukraine, where Russia-backed separatists had seized territory. Ukrainian forces did not launch an all-out offensive at first, but on the 17th of July 2014, when a flight carrying 298 people was shot down by these rebels, Ukrainian forces decided to flush out the rebels. The separatists began losing ground, so the Russian army stepped in. They invaded eastern Ukraine and fought alongside the rebels. What followed was a series of talks between Russia, Ukraine, and the West. They resulted in the Minsk Accords. This was first signed in 2014. Both sides agreed on ceasefire and military withdrawal. Ukraine agreed to hold elections in the rebel-held areas. 8 years on, the Minsk Accords remain unimplemented. Ukraine stands as the largest European country excluding Russia. It covers an area of more than 600,000 square kilometers with a population of 44 million and a GDP of more than $155 billion. Per capita income, more than $3,700. Today, Ukraine is divided between East and West in more ways than one. The West sees itself as more European. The East is closer to Russia, be it in terms of geography or sentiment. In the West, most Ukrainians speak Ukrainian. In the East, a third are native Russians. In the West, Russia is looked at with suspicion. In the East, Russia is looked at through the lens of shared history and heritage. Ukraine also remains at war. Its forces are fighting the rebels in the East. Rebel leaders are ruling at least two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Together, they're known as the Donbas region. Russia has once again sent its troops. This time, they're stationed right at the border. What does Vladimir Putin want? For NATO to stop expanding. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance. These countries are the founding members of NATO. These countries joined it during the Cold War, and these countries joined after it. Ukraine wants to join NATO too, but Putin wants NATO to exclude Ukraine and every former Soviet state. And this is just half the story. Like I said, a lot is hidden in history. For starters, there is domestic politics. When Putin annexed Crimea, his approval rating skyrocketed. Keeping the nationalistic drum rolling helps the Russian president. Annexing parts of Ukraine also helps Putin restore Russia's superpower image. Again, back to history. Many Russians view Ukraine's independence as a mistake. It is true that Ukraine was ruled by Russia. In fact, Ukraine has barely remained independent pre-1991. There was a brief period before World War I, and then another stint in 1600. For the rest of its modern history, Ukraine was under Russia. 1 in 6 Ukrainians is an ethnic Russian. 1 in 3 speaks Russian as a native language. So Putin is right when he says historically they were one. But claiming Ukraine on the basis of colonial history is wrong. It will be like Britain claiming India, or South Africa, or Spain claiming the Philippines. Past imperialism cannot justify present-day expansionism. Here's what else history tells us. Ukraine was forcefully Russified. Cut to 1700, Russian leader Catherine the Great started Russifying Ukraine. Ethnic Russians were shipped to this part of the world. Schools were told to teach Russian language. By 1800, the Ukrainian language was banned. In 1930s, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin steered a famine in Ukraine. Millions of Eastern Ukrainians were killed. The area was then repopulated with ethnic Russians. In the 1940s, the ethnic Tatars were relocated. They too were replaced with Russians. There is a reason why Eastern Ukraine today has so many native Russian speakers. It was designed to be that way. Eastern Ukraine was always dear to Russia. It has coal, it has iron, fertile land. Its historical connection with Russia was forced. Putin time and again talks about the Holy Rus. He says Russians and Ukrainians are one people. 70% Ukrainians reject this thought. 72% consider Russia a hostile state. Today, 33.3% Ukrainians are ready to take up arms against Russia. 21.7% are ready to stage a civil resistance against Russia. 67% Ukrainians want to join the EU. 59% want to join the NATO. Meet the current current Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, he came to power in 2019 following a landslide victory. He's a vocal critic of Russia. Zelensky openly opposes Russian occupation of eastern Ukraine. 73% of Ukrainian voters voted this man to power. Today, Volodymyr Zelensky represents the pulse of Ukraine, the Ukraine that wants to remain independent of Russia. But Vladimir Putin wants to become the man who revived Russian imperialism. He does not realize the world has moved on.
Okay, so we saw one description of the story. Another description of the story is what I call the path to the poorest country in Europe. Again, I'm using a video to show you what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Ukraine is the Paris Hilton of countries. Every time they are mentioned in the media, it's usually because something bad has happened. When we think of Ukraine, we think of Chernobyl, the war with Russia, or the corruption scandal that led to Trump's first impeachment. And the truth is that Ukrainian history is a real tearjerker. Seriously, if one day you get fired from your job and your partner leaves you, or any other misfortune happens to you, read something about the history of Ukraine, or watch this video, and I promise it will make you feel better. We are talking, after all, about the poorest country in Europe. In terms of GDP per capita, Ukrainians are as poor as citizens of El Salvador or Turkmenistan. However, all this could change, and we are about to see the moment of truth. In the coming months, the president of Ukraine faces the great dilemma on which the future of his country depends. By the end of this video, you'll have a better idea of what I'm talking about. But why is Ukraine so poor? And some will say, it's obvious, Grant. Ukraine belonged to the Soviet Union. They had a communist past, and now they're poor. However, there are many other countries that were also part of the Soviet orbit and are now prosperous democracies with a good quality of life. Poland, the Czech Republic, and Estonia are now prosperous countries with living standards comparable to any European country. And curiously, Poland and the Czech Republic are now full of Ukrainians. Ukrainians who come for a few months to work, for example in construction, and then return to their country. In fact, almost 12% of Ukraine's entire GDP comes from remittances from abroad. It's estimated that more than 10 million Ukrainians work abroad, even if only for a few months a year. And I say it is estimated because most of the Ukrainian economy is informal. Remember, we are talking about a country that is currently in open war with Russia. And no, that is not the only reason why they are so poor. So the questions we are asking today are, just why is Ukraine so poor? What is going on in this country where 30 years after leaving communism, they are worse off than they were as part of the Soviet Union? Today, we're going to answer all of these questions. But first, let's look at a little bit of history.
Capitalism that never came to be.
Have you ever heard about the Antonov AN-225 aircraft? It is the largest aircraft in the world. By the way, if you want to know all the technical details of this flying colossus, you can check out this video on our sister channel, Mega Projects. Well, this technical prodigy is made entirely in Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine is one of the 9 countries in the world where you can manufacture airplanes without ever leaving the country. They have the entire aerospace production chain within their own borders. Few countries can boast so much technology. And despite all this though, Ukraine is still as poor as Turkmenistan or El Salvador. And if you don't find that intriguing, here's another fact. Ukraine has natural resources of all kinds: iron, uranium, and all kinds of metals. They also have some of the most fertile land for agriculture in the world. I'm talking about the so-called Chernozem, or black earth, which is a type of soil that is apparently fantastic for growing crops. In fact, for decades, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Despite all this, Ukraine has suffered a Nazi and then a Soviet invasion. During Stalin's time, the population was subjected to one of the most terrible famines in history, the so-called Holodomor. And after the fall of communism, Ukraine was one of the poorest republics in the entire Soviet orbit. A country that was also divided into 2 large groups: a Russian-speaking people, who were in the eastern regions, and a Ukrainian-speaking people, who were in the west. As you can imagine, these divisions go beyond language. The Ukrainian-speaking population wants Ukraine to become a market economy, trading with Europe. The Russian-speaking population wants to maintain a centralized economy and maintain trade ties with Russia. And all of this explains why Ukraine had never had a real transition to capitalism. Proof of this is that to this day, they still have over 3,600 state-owned enterprises. And all this has to do with how they privatized their economy. To make this easy, think of it this way. Soviet communism was based on a state-run economy. That is, all enterprises were state-owned, from the big energy companies to the last chocolate factory. Therefore, the most important step in a transition from communism to capitalism is to privatize almost all these enterprises. And this is why Ukraine, Poland, Estonia, the Czech Republic, and almost all the countries of the former Soviet Union underwent privatization processes in the 1990s. However, as we always say here on Visualpolitik, the devil is in the details. For a better understanding, let's compare the privatization cases of the Czech Republic with those in Ukraine. If you've been subscribed to this channel for a long time, you already know this story because we have told you it more than once. If you're not subscribed to Visualpolitik, what are you doing with your life? Subscribe now and hit the little bell button so you don't miss any of our cool updates. But for now, let's get back to our story. After the fall of Soviet communism, the Czech government calculated the value of all its enterprises and divided it into vouchers. These vouchers were then sold to citizens at a moderate price. In fact, 80% of citizens bought some of these vouchers, which could later be exchanged for company shares. In other words, when the government auctioned the company in question, it was relatively easy to buy shares in the company. Today, almost every Czech citizen owns shares in Czech companies. All this explains why the Czech Republic is one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. Few people know it, but the Czech Republic is one of the countries with the smallest gap between rich and poor in the world. They even surpass the Nordic countries. The case of Ukraine, though, is completely different. Yes, it is true, the state also sold vouchers of its enterprises to citizens, but with a difference. Let's imagine that we are a Ukrainian citizen in the 1990s, working in that chocolate factory we talked about earlier. The state tells us that it's going to privatize the company, and that, for the equivalent of $1,500, we can buy a stake. When the company is auctioned, we can exchange our small piece of paper for a package of shares. So far, so good, right? Well, no. The problem is that this piece of paper is not worth anything until the company is auctioned and we can exchange it for real shares. And that moment never comes. Think about it. The elites ruling the new Ukraine were the same that had been in power during the Soviet Union. They only changed the name of the party from the Communist Party to the Social Democratic Party. Otherwise, the same faces, the same ideas, and the same interests. So what's the conclusion? Well, you had a voucher that was good for nothing. And that is when the oligarch of the moment arrives. A gentleman by the name of Petro Poroshenko. Remember that name because it will be important later on. Well, this Petro Poroshenko and many others like him is a gentleman well connected with the government who has raised some money with friends and relatives. And this nice gentleman comes to us and he says, look, that little piece of paper you have is worthless and you need money, right? Well, I'll give you $100 for it and at least you can pay rent this month. So, what do? Well, obviously, you sell it to him. And just after Mr. Poroshenko bought the paper from me and all my co-workers, turns out, surprise, the state comes and auctions the chocolate factory. In other words, for very little money, Poroshenko has taken over the ownership of an entire chocolate factory. Take that, Willy Wonka. And so, this is how the Roshen Group was born in 1996, which today is the leading manufacturer of sweets in Ukraine. In fact, Mr. Poroshenko is known as the King of Chocolate. So, Poroshenko is an example of an oligarch. To give you an idea, it is estimated that 85% of Ukraine's wealth is in the hands of oligarchs. We could say that oligarchs are kind of like the American dream, but a horrible, twisted version of it. They are big businessmen who become rich thanks to political favors. So, actually, they're exactly like the American dream. For example, do you remember the Chernozem that is so fertile for cultivation? Well, almost all farmland in Ukraine is in the hands of just 25 landowners. And you will say, what's the problem with that? That's the market, my friend. Well, it's certainly not. Until recently, the sale and purchase of agricultural land in Ukraine was prohibited. In other words, the oligarchs took over the land during the privatizations and the law protects them to keep it no matter what happens. Ukrainian agriculture is totally unproductive. Despite having hyper-fertile land, 70% of the land produces half as much per hectare as the United States. On top of all this, we have to add corruption scandals in state-owned companies. To give you an idea, the largest company in the country is Naftogaz. I'm so sorry, Ukrainians. Naftogaz is the Ukrainian Ukrainian state gas company, which belongs, as you would guess, to the state. According to a think tank in Kiev, corruption in this company accounts for more than $3 billion a year. And obviously, all this corruption translates into losses in the millions. In 2014 alone, Naftogaz losses accounted for more than 60% of Ukrainian GDP. In other words, Ukraine is poor in large part because of the corruption of the Ukrainian elites themselves. But I know what many of you are thinking. Let's see. Technically, Ukraine is at war with Russia, right? They have whole regions overrun by Russia. Does this really not have an economic impact? And yes, it does. We're going to check that out right now.
The moment of truth.
Unless you live in a cave, sorry everyone who lives in Wales, you will know that Russia and Ukraine are bitter enemies. This was started after the Euromaidan protests. Thousands of young people took to the streets of Kiev to protest against the government. They were violently repressed by the police, but eventually they succeeded in overthrowing the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych. What you all probably don't know is why all this started. Think about it. Until 2014, most Ukrainians did not want to join Nato. At that time, Russia was the country's main trading partner. So what happened for the situation to have taken such a drastic turn? Well, it all started because of this piece of news.
Ukraine suspends talks on EU trade pact as Putin wins tug of war. The Guardian.
To summarize, until 2013, Russia was Ukraine's main trading partner. Russia sold its gas and Ukraine sold its metals and grain. However, Ukraine did not want to be so dependent on the Kremlin. And that's what led them to start negotiating for a free trade agreement with the European Union. At the end of 2013, the president of Ukraine was about to sign such a treaty, but Putin pressured him to back out. Remember I was telling you that Ukraine is divided into two halves? Well, the Ukrainian-speaking half considered that vetoing of this treaty was a betrayal. And that is what caused the Euromaidan protests to break out. These protests served to overthrow Yanukovych. And then the Russian-speaking half felt betrayed. And what are the regions with the most Russian speakers in the whole country? Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. These three regions wanted to secede from the rest of Ukraine.
Создание суверенного государства Донецкая Народная Республика.
Russia supported the separatists, and that's how the Ukrainian war broke out. We will talk about all of this in depth in another video, but today we are going to focus on the economy. Because the first economic consequence of this war was the end of trade with Russia. Take a look at this graph. As you can see, when Ukraine stops trading with Russia, it starts trading with the European Union. As of today, Brussels is Kiev's main trading partner. And many of you would think that this was a whole new beginning for Ukraine. A change, of course. The end of the pro-Russian oligarchy, right? Well, not really. Can you guess who was the next Ukrainian president after the deposed Yanukovych? Listen up.
Chocolate King Poroshenko wins Ukraine presidency, but violence continues. The conversation.
That's right, the Ukrainian Willy Wonka. Ukraine replaced the Russian-speaking oligarchy with the Ukrainian-speaking oligarchy. Everything changed in order for everything to stay the same. Since then, Ukraine has promised a myriad of anti-corruption schemes. Several civil society platforms have emerged to bring the most blatant cases to court. But at the same time, the elites in Kiev have tried to put on the brakes on as many of these proposals as possible. And so it continued until 2019. What happened then? Well, we're going to take a look at that now.
General cleaning?
Do you remember the first impeachment against Trump? I know, there were so many. If you remember, it all started because Trump allegedly promised some military aid to Ukraine in exchange for opening an investigation against Biden. It was 2019. And that's how the world met the new Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky.
Звертаюсь до Петра Порошенко. Ви кличете мене на дебати. Мріяли, що я втечу, відморожусь, заховаюсь. Ні. Я це не ви у 14-му.
Okay, let me put you in the picture. Imagine that Martin Sheen, after playing the role of the President of the United States in The West Wing, is running for President of the United States, but for real. Well, that is exactly the case with Zelensky. We're talking about a TV actor and comedian who became famous for playing the role of the President of Ukraine. At the high point of his acting career, he ran for election. Few would have bet on his political career, but against all the odds, in May 2019, he won the election over Petro Poroshenko. So long, Willy Wonka. His message was, I am neither pro-Russian nor anti-Russian. My enemy is corruption and oligarchs. And that explains why, under his government, measures like this have been passed.
Ukrainian parliament adopts law on opening farmland markets starting July 2021. Baker McKenzie.
Do you remember those laws that shielded the Ukrainian oligarchs? Well, little by little, the Ukrainian government is changing them. In February 2021, they froze the accounts of another pro-Russian oligarch, billionaire Viktor. All these measures are very important for Ukraine. They serve not only to clean up the country, but they are also essential for allowing it to receive international aid. For example, Ukraine has asked for a $5 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. But this loan will only come if Ukraine is serious about its fight against corruption. At this point, I know what many of you are thinking. Zelensky must be a hero to the Ukrainians, right? The man who is wielding justice against all the oligarchs, right? Well, he's not. Zelensky began his presidency with huge popularity ratings, but in the last year, he has plummeted. What's more, his party took a real beating in the last municipal elections. Many would think that this is all due to the coronavirus. These are bad times to govern any country. But remember, we are talking about Ukraine, the country of the Ukrainian dream, which is like the American dream, but worse. Achieving success in Ukraine without counting on the oligarchs is practically impossible, and that also includes Zelensky.
U.S. imposes sanctions on Ukrainian oligarch Igor Kolomoisky over alleged corruption. Financial Times.
And this is where the real moment of truth comes for Ukraine. Who is Igor Kolomoisky, you may ask? Well, none other than the owner of this TV station where Zelensky became famous. And not only that, he is also one of the main supporters of the current president of Ukraine. So much so that he's even been his chief of staff during the first years of his presidency. In other words, even the scourge of corruption in Ukraine has depended on an oligarch to get himself known. And what is good old Kolomoisky accused of? Well, you see, in addition to owning a television station, Kolomoisky was the owner of a private bank. The bank is responsible for a fraud that has cost the state coffers more than $5.5 billion. So we're talking about corruption on a grand scale. And this, as I said, is the real moment of truth for Zelensky. The usual thing in these cases would be for the government to bend over backwards to save him from jail. It would not be the first time that a Ukrainian oligarch gets off scot-free from a trial thanks to his political connections. In other words, Ukraine is in a real dilemma. The outcome of this dilemma is key to the future of the country. And so now the question is over to you. Will it be different this time? Will Zelensky allow his friend to be put on trial? Is Ukraine really ready to do away with oligarchical elites and end corruption? Is it possible that Ukraine will be rich one day? And just how badly did I butcher all those names? You can leave your answers in the comments below. And as always,
So we see that Ukraine has a lot of history which influence what happened today. This is the last slide, and I'm not going to answer the question I'm posed. Assigning blames to the current conflict. Can we blame USA? Can we blame Nato? Can we blame European Union refusing Russia? Now this part I will answer what do I mean by this next week. And then the puppets in Ukraine. And of course, lastly, Russia. How do you want to assign blames to these parties? Are there any parties which shouldn't be carrying any blames to the current conflict? That is the question, and I think I will answer these questions a few weeks later because we still have a lot of issues to cover. The main question today, why China doesn't support sanctions to Russia, hasn't been answered yet because we need to answer this question first. Who is to blame for the current conflict? Unless we can settle on this one, we cannot settle on whether sanctioning Russia is a proper line to resolve the current issues. Thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.